All right, coach. So I know in the last 19 years, you're with Utah Jazz and you start from a team manager and now you're currently the director of performance. Can you share your journey? Because I bet a lot of young coaches or a lot of young guys just want to be a strength coach at high level jobs. How do you got yourself from team manager to strength intern and then director of performance?
Yeah. Um, a lot of luck, a lot of luck of being in the right place at the right time. Very fortunate for that perspective. But I think the other thing is just never being too big to do any type of job. I think an important part of what we do as practitioners is assist the team in so many different ways. And so I was fortunate enough to kind of learn how to be a fly on the wall while also being a resource for a lot of different areas. And um, I first thought I wanted to go more into athletic training, so I really observed them while I was in the team manager position. And then as I started to look a little bit more into sports performance, I tried to absorb as much as I could from my boss in that position at the time. And I think just allowing myself to be a sponge and try to absorb as much information from all the different roles and how they interact together, but then also work it from a singular standpoint. And I think that's one of the things that's been helpful for me is starting at an early age and kind of being somebody that did some of the dirty work and never being afraid to do anything that was asked of me is an important skill. I never think I'm too, busy or too high up on the chain of command to clean up the weight room, to spray things down and to even stock coolers. There was a period during COVID where really one of my main roles was like making sure that guys stay hydrated and making sure that it was contained within, this guy's bottle was over here and this guy's bottle, and I took it really serious. I take each of my tasks and each of the duties that are called upon me really serious, and I try to do them, with the most effort and energy, and I think that's something that's hopefully served me well. It's allowed me to kind of take on more tasks too. I think once you become a master of the simple tasks, you can take on more, and that becomes second nature. And then as you're adding more to your um, daily duties and things that you have to do, it's easier to be somebody that guys can come with more problems, or if a GM asks something more of you, then it's like, perfect, I've got these tasks down. I can take that on even easier. And I think that's just something that has helped me kind of progress through this career a little bit more.
Nice, nice. So in the last 15 years, you've been a strength coach, right? So the field has changed a lot since not to say 15 years ago, it changed a lot in the last 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
So in the last 15 years, can you kind of share what is it like when you started? And how do you see our field change and where do you see it's going to be in the future?
Yeah, great question. So it's changed a ton, I think, just in terms of the amount of resources that are allocated to sports performance. I think there was a huge emphasis in the NBA when I first started on, well, basketball is what they do, and this is the most important part. And so we put a ton of resources here, and everybody else just kind of get by with what you have. And that doesn't mean that we didn't feel supported, but from the organization, to get the equipment and things that we needed. But I think at the time it was like what we have has been working. Let's just keep continuing down the path. So I remember when I first was traveling, I had these two big Husky crates and I had to load them up with medicine balls and all sorts of equipment that we could use in the hallways and use in as much space as we can. I was doing single leg Bulgarian squats on like a folding chair and different things like that. Just anything that I could find, in the hallways of the weight room or really just in the hallways of the arena. And I think now we've kind of gotten so far as to where it's like so many different wearables and tech, and we need to invest in more flashy things that guys may have seen in college to compete with other organizations. So I definitely think the resources and the allocation of resources have gotten a lot better. Um, Another area where I think it is staffs have gotten bigger. I was one of the only kind of interns, assistants when I first started. Most teams only had one head strength coach and you got by. And now I think with teams getting bigger to where they're carrying two ways and up to 20 guys at any given time, it's such a big task for one person to handle that. And so I think staffs have gotten bigger. They're allocating, more funds to contracts and things like that just to make sure that we get, maybe it's like a three or a 1-to-6 ratio, 1-to-7 ratio, a little bit more manageable. And some of the other ways that it's changed, I think, is, I mentioned the tech is the expectations on what we're delivering to front office. So that may be, I know in-house we brought in over 100 guys for the pre-draft period, so it's one of those where it's like they're putting a larger emphasis on some of the things that we're doing from a testing standpoint. They're putting a larger emphasis on some of the metrics or opinions that we come up with through our battery of tests. Um, and so I think, all of it is really great, but it's definitely changed a ton. It's not just basketball anymore. It's we're drafting, younger athletes that are really skilled in basketball, but maybe not so physically developed. And they're realizing, hey, we need to put a larger emphasis on this athletic development and see how much better basketball how much better athletes they can be at basketball if we just start to work in this area. So I really appreciate that a ton. They gave our staff a nice block of maybe 7 or 8 weeks early this off season where it was like, whatever you guys want to do, we support you. We can take the basketballs away. It can be strictly just athletic development. And that was kind of like, okay, wow, so different from, hey, you have 20 minutes 3 days a week and make what works work, and now it's kind of like, hey, we know that we're drafting guys that are really skilled on the court, but let's see where else we can kind of help this development and kind of bridge this gap. Because a lot of them just have played, AAU for so long and kind of skipped over the athletic development standpoint and the training standpoint. So their training age is much lower than where they're at when they're coming into the NBA. So I think the whole approach has changed a ton. I think the availability of tech has changed a ton. I think the allocation of resources has changed. um, it feels totally different. I think my first couple years, we were dealing with athletes that were 23, 24 years old. And now I'm dealing with most of my athletes are under 21 years old, and so we're just changing. I think the athletes that are coming in are totally different too. So it's definitely changed on one end of the spectrum to the other, but I've also seen it kind of bob and weave over these last 15 years where, um, it as much as it's different, at the end of the day, it's still basketball and it's still the same. We still got to get them better on the court.
Nice, nice. It's actually really interesting that you brought up that some of the athlete right now going to the NBA, they probably are not that probably lack of athletic development, right? Uh this I was having a conversation with a college strength coach with all this NIL going on, like you literally can't have a like long-term athletic development. And obviously it also affect you guys, how you guys train the athletes. So uh and like you mentioned, like the way you train athletes like maybe 10 years ago are probably different than how you're going to train your athlete right now because the the athlete you're getting are different. So can I talk a little bit about um how do you like how your approach changes throughout the year in terms of like just performance enhancement?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, The biggest thing, as you pointed out, right, is we might have been able to kind of look at the athletes that we draft and go, okay, they're going to be here for 5 to 6 years. We can work on this in little doses. And now it's like, some of these guys aren't, their careers are under 4 years. Um, so one of the biggest emphasis that we have is, during the pre-draft process, we're going to try to collect as much information as we can and formulate a plan of attack. So that way, the minute that we know that we're going to draft them, or the minute that we do draft them, it's almost like, okay, cool. We have some baseline information here, right? We have maybe some things that we can do to create a needs analysis. That way, you know, pretty much they get drafted and then we start summer league a week and a half after. So you're almost right into competition right after that. So if we can collect as much information about them and how we might be able to build a needs analysis, we can start right away with where are they at on the training spectrum? Did they sport specialize? That's one of the questionnaires that we'll deliver during the draft process. So then we know, okay, this person or this athlete was a three sport athlete for a while. Okay, so that means they might be a little bit better of a mover in three different planes. They might be, they might be different than some of the strict basketball athletes that they sport specialized when they were 10 years old, just based off of that information, right? Then we also have some of our movement efficiency screens that we have. And it's like, okay, we have that baseline information. We get them here. We already know that we need to work on A, B, and C. Um, so the big part is we'll draft them. And then it's kind of right away to work. How do we optimize this kind of week and a half, 2 week period before they start to play summer league? So that might be just kind of, are they in bucket one, two, or three, right? Meaning bucket one, we need to work on everything. Their movement efficiency is poor, their strength is poor, and their training age is low. Right. Bucket two might be one or two of those. A bucket three would be like a gem. We found somebody that was really in a college program for a couple years. They have a great foundation. They're a great mover, and they're able for us to start to load them right away. And so from there, we'll kind of put them in buckets, and we'll kind of create a plan for that 4 week block that we have them throughout summer league, try to optimize the training windows that we can. And then the next period is similar to where we're at right now. We'll get them in town for another 6 weeks or so, kind of OTAs, open gym, optional training period. And this is where, we'll know where they're at in their buckets. And it's like, okay, cool. How do we optimize your athletic development outside of the court for this 6 week block that we can actually maybe train a little bit harder? We're not playing games, we're not traveling. Let's, dive into some of the development there. And then from there, we kind of have to get into the regular season, right? And that's going to be, you know, how much are they playing? And that's kind of one of those where we'll start to learn a little bit early in the season, maybe what the rotation is, things like that. Is this going to be more of a development guy that's going to spend a lot of time in the G League? So, how do we implement the plan down with Garrett and his group? And I think that's the other thing that is difficult, is just actually getting the training time in season is going to be difficult, right? We know that. So a big part of that is the acute. How do we get the most success and the most amount of work and the most volume in a safe manner for those first kind of 7 to 8 months that we have? Then the other big aspect of this is the conversation with front office and coaches. Is this a player that we see that we're going to be with for a long period? And if that's the case, we know we might have another off season next year that we need to kind of get right away. Is this somebody that they're looking at for the short term? Is this somebody that's kind of filling a role on the roster where we see them for a couple years and just we're not really sure what our investment is on them yet? And so I think it's big discussions on front office. How do they see this athlete moving forward? And then us also taking a look at you know, what's their injury history like? Do we think that we can optimize that for a certain period of time? And so it's kind of a little bit of a navigating each case by case situation. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is starting to get the habits down right away. So that first period where we have them for summer league is like a no nonsense period. It's we're gonna teach you how to work as a professional athlete. We're gonna get your habits down, and we're also going to teach you a lot. We're going to teach you how to do the homework at home, how to make sure that you're doing your recovery stuff at home. You know, what are some of the things that you need to do outside of this building so when you come in here, we can get right to work. And I think that's a big part of it. And then from there, we'll kind of understand, okay, just how far is this athlete on that spectrum, and how do we optimize this first year that we have with them? That's an important part for us.
Nice, nice, nice. So, um, I think a huge part of your job is like probably get athletes buy in since probably a lot of them are like superstars, millionaires or like billionaires. So how do you, let's say probably a young like just drafted player like go to you, how do you like uh how to interact with the athlete, how do you get buy-in from them versus a like probably a veteran that been in the league for like a long time, maybe 10 years or so. How do you interact with them?
Yeah, no, you know, you definitely have to wear many hats and maybe approach each person very differently. You know, one of the things that I think is important is understanding who they are and where they came from. So if we get a new player and it's a draft eligible player, so they're going to be younger, I'm going to do a little homework on, okay, what university did you go to? Where are you from a geographic standpoint? Um, and basically try to, you know, not necessarily formulate my own opinions, but get a little bit of a background history on who they might be as an athlete. The next part is when we do get them in the building, I treat everybody tough but fair, right? Meaning I'm going to coach you hard and I'm coach everybody hard, but I'm going to be fair, meaning I'm going to let you know where the boundaries are within our program. And also I'm going to let you know what the expectations are. And I think that's a really huge part where they understand this is no longer uh, a fun hobby for you. You are a professional athlete and this is a job, just like my job is to get you better. And I think that's the approach that I try to take with the young guys to get them to shift that mentality from this has been a hobby and this has been something that I do is I just hoop to no, there are a lot of people that come into this building and this is a professional job and we're all going to treat it as such. And I think just setting those expectations early on is really important. Being fair and being consistent is really important too. Meaning, you know, showing each athlete the attention that they deserve, but also holding them to what our expectations are is really important with our young athletes. Um, on the contrary, you know, we've had different veterans come in and out. Kelly Olynyk, we just had last year, where he's been on 6 to 7 different teams. You know, he's been a journeyman around the league, and I think part of that is gathering intel maybe from other coaches. So I'll call a lot of the colleagues and say, "Hey, what have you done from a training standpoint with him?" So that way I understand maybe what he's been exposed to, what they haven't been exposed to, and then I try to do the same thing, you know, set some expectations maybe for our program, but then also understand, hey, I know that you've been other places. So if there are things that have worked for you in the past, please tell me. This is a partnership that, you know, I want the most success for you while you're here. And so if there are certain things that have worked for you, we're not going to change that. But also at the same time, there might be a skill or two or a different type of training approach that you can add to your tool belt. You know, so I'll call it the tool belt approach, meaning what have you done in the past? Oh, okay, cool. You know how to use this tool and you know how to use that tool. Oh, you're not as sharp with that. Let's add this to your routine this year. That way you can continue to get better and stack these bricks and add these tools to your tool belt. And then that way, if your period here is short, then at least you got something from our program. I think that's the important part is I want to make sure that everybody feels like we added value to their career or we added value to their ability to perform out there on the court. And I think that's, a different approach than maybe with the young guys because I know that their tool belt isn't developed yet. Instead, we got to teach them how to put the tool belt on. We got to teach them what the tools are, right? We've got to teach them you know, we're doing these set of jumps for this reason. We're tracking these metrics for these reasons. It's a lot more getting them to understand what we're doing as a program. And the biggest thing overall that we try to do with all of our athletes is we care for them, right? I care about every individual as a human being. I try to be very consistent with the time, the energy, the resources that we give to them because at the end of the day, we're all human. We all have a lot of struggles. We all have different things going on. To your point, some of them might be millionaires and doing well financially. Some of them might be a little lower end on the spectrum and still hunting for some of those contracts. But if I can consistently show love and appreciation and empathy towards whatever they might be doing on a human level, that's going to increase a ton of buy-in because it's easier to work with people that care about you. It's harder when you see, oh man, that coach, he only always coaches that guy over there. He never shows me. It's going to be harder for them to buy in and do what I want them to do. Whereas if I treat number one through number 20 all the same with love, empathy, and care, chances are they're all going to come together as a group and feel better as one group and also individually.
Nice, nice. This is awesome. This is awesome. Another interesting topic you brought up, which is also interesting, is uh programming or lifting during the season, right? And I know like there's teams that do pre-game lift, there's teams that do post-game lift, there's teams that lift the day after the game. Uh, what are your thoughts on like overall training during the season?
Yeah. Yeah, my thoughts have shifted a couple different times. And I think sometimes, to your point that we just spoke about, if you get an athlete and they're maybe used to something, you adjust to that with them. Um, the biggest thing that we like to do is we call it like our stoplight approach. So every game day is going to be high for everybody. And the way that we can do that is we might know the guys that are going to have a higher demand during the game. The guys that won't have as high as demand during the game, we're going to make sure that we get that during shoot around. So if you're not going to play that night, or if we think that you might be lower on the end of the minutes, we're going to play 3-on-3. We're going to get your lift in after shoot around or before shoot around. We're going to make sure that everybody's kind of high on game days, right? So that way we already know that's a big day. The next thing we're going to do is we take a look at the calendar, right? So you have these game days. If it's a day in between games, that might be a yellow day. So from the stoplight approach, meaning, you know, that there's going to be some people that'll be working a little bit higher, some guys that will be working a little bit lower if they just played, but we're always going to get something done on our yellow days, right? And that's going to be maybe some more tendon loading. Maybe that's extra conditioning for the guys that didn't get as much of a burn. You say you were used to playing 20 minutes a game and last night you only got 10. Well, either after the game, you'll get that extra supplemental conditioning, or on the next day, you'll get that. We're going to add some of our days where we can sneak in some hypertrophy lifts. So, guys that might be needing to add some mass, we're going to do some upper body auxiliary lifts, things like that. Say it's a game on Monday and we have a rare break until Tuesday, or I'm sorry, until Thursday. So Monday and Thursday, right? So a high game day on Monday, maybe it's a yellow on Tuesday, and then it's going to be a green on Wednesday. Green days, we're lifting again. We're getting heavy. We're getting ready. We're prepping the nervous system for the game. It might not necessarily be a high demand in terms of sprinting and things like that, but we're going to get a heavy priming lift that day. Um, the difficult part is when you play every other day. right? There's periods where we play every other day. What we try to do is the guys that are playing heavy minutes, we're going to get your heavy lift right after the game. And then what that's going to do is open up that window for in between game days where it's still a yellow day, but you're going to be doing maybe some more restorative things. We're going to be getting back to, range of motion, trying to restore tissue tolerance, things like that. Um, the guys that, let's say, aren't playing as much, the same thing, you're going to have a high day, but then the next day, you might get some of your conditioning in. You might get some of those stressors of sprints in on that day, knowing that you've only been playing 3-on-3 on Monday and Wednesday. So it's difficult, right? Because sometimes you have to have like your high volume guys and your low volume guys, and there might be guys that kind of float in between. And those are the ones that it's difficult because you have to figure out which track you're on. So from a 7 day standpoint, we really try to make our game days really high for everybody. And then we try to fit in, is it a yellow day? Is it a green day? If it's a back to back, right? We play Tuesday, Wednesday. Everybody's going to be on a red day on Thursday. Everybody's going to be off that day. It's a get away from the building or come in the building and use our tubs, use BFR, use whatever it might be to kind of help restore your body, your mind, get you ready for that next game day. So the big part is just taking a look at the calendar and basically right away just going green, yellow, red. What does the calendar look like? Creating a plan and then somewhat adjusting on a week to week basis from there. So, yeah, I mean, to answer your earlier question, I've shifted a lot sometimes where it's like everybody has to get a post game lift because I know the next day you're going to come in and you're tired and everybody's crappy and everybody's tired from getting home at 2 o'clock in the morning and you don't feel like doing any work. But the big thing is if we can proactively separate our groups, we know that the guys that maybe got most of their work done during the shoot around period, you just already had your kind of 36-hour window of recovery. So you're going to be ready to come back in the following morning and get some work done versus the guys that just had a high volume of work and ended at 11 p.m. at night. At 10 a.m. is not maybe not the best time to try to get the most out of you. We're going to try to get you ready for practice and get you moving. So I think that's kind of where our plan's at. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the schedule doesn't allow, um, for proper recovery. And that's where we got to kind of have our interventions to come in and say, okay, this guy's played 4 and 6. This would normally be a yellow day. We got to make it a red day for this guy. We got to kind of maybe pull him from some of these full court activities and let's add in some supplemental, auxiliary lifts that might make him feel a little bit better.
Nice, nice, awesome. So, uh, next thing I want to ask is, in the past like 15 years, obviously, like there's more and more technology. Like I know that some teams have, probably all the team have force plate, 1080 connects on, and the league's gonna have like e- the league's gonna have every team do biomechanics like assessment on all
Yeah.
the players. So with more and more and more information, how do you filter out those noise to get what you want? And maybe like uh what like when is it too much?
Yeah. That's an awesome question. So we're part of the biomechanics program that the league implemented. So we were one of the first four teams, and they're telling us, we need to get this serial testing in we need four a year. Well, that might not necessarily be exactly what we want to do internally. So then you're adding more to the testing, right? It's more data, more information. I think the important part is figuring out as a program, what do you want to hang your hat on? What do you believe is going to collect the most objective information? So that way you can be consistent with what you're tracking, right? I think that's the hard part. I think my first couple years, we tried to do an RSI, and I realized very quickly with the guys that were 30 years old, it was like, yeah, dude, you're not gonna get much out of this. Like the effort wasn't there. The consistency with the data that we were collecting wasn't there. So then what type of interventions are you going to create from that, right? And so I think that's the big part is as an organization, what do you have support on as well? We have a ton of support from front office saying whatever you guys want to do, if we need to create a finding system, if we need to, help you out from that standpoint, whatever we can do to help you collect this information. So one of the things that we believe is informing the guys, like I said earlier, why we're testing this and what we're going to do with this information. I think that general knowledge for them to understand helps a little bit more with the buy-in when it's time to do this type of testing. I think the other thing that we do well is we have figured out somewhat, it's somewhat of monotonous, but the most consistent days are game days. So we try to collect our testing metrics on game days in the pregame. We'll have sort of an activation period where the guys go out on the court, we'll hit some activation. Right after that, you're going to hit a couple jumps for us. One, that's the most consistent period from an approach standpoint. And two, we also know that that's going to be somewhat when your central nervous system and when you're ready to give us a great effort, right? It might not be the next morning at 9 o'clock in the morning after a game day. Um, so from that standpoint, from the, as you mentioned, force plate standpoint and maybe movement biomechanics standpoint, we feel like that's really consistent there. The next thing that we do is we are fortunate enough to have the backing on like the Connects on. So we're tracking metrics and we're seeing what these guys are doing on the court. I think a big part of that is consolidating what are the 1 to 2 things that you're tracking. And I think that might change from athlete to athlete, right? If you have a guy that's coming back from, he's got some historical, injury risk with hamstrings. I'm definitely going to be looking at what his sprint speeds are and how many times he's hitting those metrics, right? That might be something that we're looking at here versus this guy that might have a little bit more of like, some knee issues, some degenerative knee issues that we need to monitor over time. How many times are you decelerating? What's that looking like? Are you avoiding going from a level 5 speed to a level 1 speed on the court? And I think that's where you look at those types of things case by case. You try to build your profiles on your dashboard to where you can click on the player page and it might look a little different, from an overall standpoint. I know there's some him and hawing about acute to chronic workload, right? It was really tracked for a long time, and now everybody's saying, yeah, well, what are we getting from this? Are we just looking at these highs and these lows? I personally think we've found some success and value in monitoring that, but I think you also have to take a deeper dive into who are you playing against? What was the matchup that day? Does it make sense that it was a high day because this is a run and gun team that you played against, And so trying to get ahead of, if you're tracking some of those data points, getting ahead and maybe looking at the schedule and going, okay, wow, we've got a matchup against teams A, B, and C all in a row in 1 week. Those are all really high paced teams, right? We're playing against maybe OKC, who's going to be up and down with young guys. Then we're going to play against Houston, who's also young and up and down, right? I think looking at those and just trying to make sense of the picture, it's really difficult. We've got a great director of sports science and Barnett Frank, and he's, he heads that up and he kind of helps us understand maybe what we're looking for and what makes sense. But I think it changes a ton too. We have a total different young team. So I'm a little less worried about maybe what the acute to chronic workload is and just making sure that we're getting a good amount of work and developing from that standpoint. Um, to answer your question even a little bit further about some of the technology, I think a lot of it. is too much right now. I think from my perspective, we went from being, let's say, 5 to 6 years ago, where we were the number one team with Donovan and Rudy, and the interventions were harder to maybe implement there because guys might be a little bit more stuck in their way. Coach may have a practice plan that he's not going to deter from farther away. A little bit more difficult to add some interventions versus now we have an excellent coach, Will Hardy. He's young. He knows our guys are young. He's coming to us and asking, what do you guys think? What do we need more of? Do we need more? Do we need to play more and get these guys up and down more? Do we need more time allocation on, skill development on the court? Do we need more time in the weight room for athletic development? And just trying to figure out, you only have maybe 3 to 4 hours in a day where you can jam everything in. And it's like, what's the most important part? And then I think you can use the technology maybe to guide that a little bit. But I think you also have to kind of set your parameters on what are our goals for our team. And then how is this tech going to help us reach those goals? Versus here's all this tech that we have to use it and we have to test them and we have to do all this, but then realistically, you're not really putting in the interventions.
Nice, nice. I feel like this is really cool because so I came from Taiwan and with like no technology, right? And to Louisville, you literally have everything you want. Force plate, catapult, biomechanics lab, motion capture, whatever you can think of. And uh after working after 2 years at Louisville, I do feel like having the experience before like Louisville having no force plate, having like no technology, definitely helped me understand like the movement more and what kind of question I want the technology to answer instead of like just collecting data to collect data.
You nailed it. I think that was maybe something that I've been fortunate enough to kind of be part of as well, where it's like we had to do all of this without this monitoring. We did all of this type of work. So I trust my coach's eyes sometimes more than, you know, not necessarily more than what the information's spitting out, but you can almost see it in the weight room before you go and test it, right? You're almost leading, you know, you're inferring, I'm gonna see this on the force plates. I'm gonna see this if I put him in this position on the 1080, right? I can see it on the coach's eye just by either being out there on the court or in the weight room. And what that does then is helps validate maybe what your thoughts were. And I think you nailed it in the standpoint of um asking the questions, what do I want to get from testing? And so that's the whole thing is if we're seeing things in the weight room or on the court, then maybe what's some tests or what's some battery of information that we can collect that then serially we might be able to quantify. That would be the difference, right? Is I'm seeing this guy, he is a total hip dominant mover. We're going to put him through some jump landing progressions. I'm going to use the force plates to monitor that over time. But chances are, every single time that we're going to go through these movement patterns, it's not going to be on the force plates because it's just not as efficient to test and test and test. Instead, I might test, you know, on October 1, I'm going to train him for 2 to 3 weeks, and then let's come back to it. And are the tests getting results that we want to see? And is it getting better in the weight room and on the court? And then you kind of go back again. Let's train, let's train, let's train through some of these bad habits or poor movements, things like that. Let's train in the weight room in positions that I know are you're going to benefit from. And then let's go back and test again. Did we objectively get better? Is your power getting better? Is your asymmetries getting better? Do you mechanically look better on the force plates? Okay, great. Then the program's working. Versus, right, instead, if you do all this type of training, you test, you do this type of training and you test again and it's getting worse. Okay, maybe something else is there. Is this a neuromuscular deficiency? Do we need to look at isolative strengthening on one or two of these different muscles to help you get into this movement better? But I think you nailed it. Not having the tech ahead of time helps you ask the questions that you want to use the tech to help you figure out what the results are. And I think a lot of times, a lot of times people in our position that may be coming into these jobs within the NBA, the team has invested a $500,000. You better use this tech, and I better see you using this tech, right? It's almost forced down our throats. And that's something that I think, luckily, I feel fortunate. Our director overall of performance, Eric, he worked with the Suns and Steve Nash's team and all those guys 20 years ago, where the same thing. They didn't have all that tech. And so he is a lot more supportive on let's use this to help at maybe a checks and balance system, but let's not base all of our opinions on this information that we're getting, right? Because at the end of the day, some of the testing might be hands on hips and you're doing a counter movement jump and or you're doing a drop jump. Well, we know that the sport, you're not going to have arms constrained and you're going to have a little bit more of a freedom of movement. And athlete A might get from, point A to point B different than athlete B. And that's okay. That's just, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just he has a different strategy. So then, how do we make that strategy better? How do we, make that strategy safer? And so I think overall as a program, and I think I mentioned to you earlier, my two assistants, Dantron and Denzel, they both came from HBCUs. They didn't have a ton of this tech. They worked with 3 to 4 different teams. So all of us kind of have that same approach where we're not so tech heavy to tell us what we want to see. We're going to use our coach's eye. We're going to use what we have from a resources standpoint of we know training works, we know these types of stimulus work, and then we'll use the tech as sort of a checks and balances. And or if we have to take a deeper dive and we know that the tech helps us with A, B, or C, then we'll use that tech for that.
Nice. This is awesome. Perfect. Because I do feel like a lot of young guys like rely on technology kind of too much. And sometimes like I mentioned, I was doing consulting job. I feel like sometimes like coaches probably need to back off a little bit, right? Uh, I remember that when I was at Louisville, there's like a player that he's our starting like point guard, like really explosive. And we're actually asking him to do snatch on that day with velocity based training. You can clearly see that he's super tired. You can just see it. But the number is like way up. It's like three something. I'm like, is this wrong or I'm wrong? But like, I was like, man, he's tired. I'm not gonna put weight anymore. Just do that. Just go through the motion. He's tired enough.
Yeah. And I think that's the experience of your coaching speaking there, right? I think sometimes these athletes, they're high level athletes because they have worked into those positions, and I think some of them whether they may be hyper people pleasers or whatnot, right? But they're willing to grind themselves into the ground to give you what you want to see. And I think that's up to us as coaches to understand the human element and go, okay, I know that this kid, he's going to give me everything every single time. So am I just grinding them into the ground by asking for a stimulus that they're not quite ready for, or that they're not, that all of these signs here and all these subjective information that I've seen and collected tell me that he's tired, but he's still giving this output. What's the benefit of that? I think that's the other trade-off too. And I think that's the skill as a coach is trying to figure out, how to push your athletes, but also how to make sure that you're pushing them in a safe and controlled manner to set them up to perform for whatever they have to perform for. And I think that's the difficult thing about the tech sometimes is my eyes are telling me one thing, the tech's telling me other. What do I want to trust the most? And I think that's the difficult aspect of maybe leaning too much on tech is you're taking away the human element, and that's a huge part of what we do is just being able. And then I would say the next layer to that is say something were to happen, right? Say this athlete were to be depleted and they had a horrible game, or they, worst case scenario got injured, you almost just lost your buy-in.
Yeah.
You almost just lost your buy-in because you knew they might not have been ready for this. You still pushed it. Something happened and they no longer trust you, you know? And I wouldn't say that you err on the side of caution, but as you mentioned, at the end of the day, he's your star player. They're there to perform the sport. They are not there to perform what this this number that you're trying to
Yeah.
achieve, you know? And so I think that's just a huge skill as a coach is understanding maybe where your athletes are at. And I think a part of that, as we mentioned earlier, is getting enough time with them in the off season to know where that threshold might be, right? If you've got a high achieving athlete that really wants to be the best at every single thing, well, perfect. You can kind of tease some of that out in the off season when they don't have to go play their sport, and you can see where that threshold is. So then that way you can tap into that a little bit in the season, but you also don't tap them out in season. And I think that's a huge skill.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. Last thing, last topic, okay? Big one. I'm gonna put you on the spot to answer this one. So, with all like the Achilles tendon injury right now, like everybody's trying to figure it out with this trend. What are your thoughts on like, because obviously like they don't have a lot back then, right?
Yeah.
Why is it more and more like right now?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult uh each team's approach is so different. So it's hard for me to speak on a different team or things like that. I like to speak on the things that we do here. Um, I think one of the biggest issues is what we mentioned earlier is we now are seeing the end of a development period, right? We are seeing the tip top mountain peak of human performance. We're not seeing what they did through all this period, right? And so, unfortunately, as our athletes are becoming more explosive, they're becoming, you know, let's say 20 years ago, if you had an athlete that was 6'10", he was the anomaly, right? And chances are he was a bigger athlete. Now we're seeing 6'10" athletes that are high flyers that can control the ball, that are doing, different things and different skills that we're asking them to do. Um, Now my biggest question would be, you know, what did they do for the last 15 years to prepare them for this speed of game, this demand of game, this training load that they're seeing, in terms of the NBA and our travel and things like that, right? Um, so I think a lot of it has to do with the building blocks of these athletes. I think we don't see as many robust athletes that we maybe saw 10 years ago. 12 years ago, right? So I think that's an important layer that we cannot disregard is these athletes just aren't as robust athletes as what we've seen. Secondly, I think the important part is um, we mentioned it. How do you get guys to buy in? I think a lot of practitioners, would say, are the athletes holding up their end of the deal? Meaning, are they doing everything that we ask of them from a recovery standpoint, from a reduction in inflammation standpoint? It's hard for me to say that you're doing everything when I know you went out and kind of partied last night, and that's the human element of it. I would never say that I don't think anybody's to blame, for these injuries. I think it's unfortunate because it's a multitude of factors that are coming in. It's a human element of these athletes. We're asking them to basically sacrifice 8 years of their lives and do everything that we ask. Because if you do everything that we ask, then we should be okay, right? Well, that's not how humans work. They're going to go home and they might have kids. They can't stay off their feet. They have other things that they have to go and do. I think that's a huge, huge part of it. And then another big part of it too is um, there's a lack of consistency. And what I mean by that is one, the training schedule, there's a lack of consistency. Two, how these guys move throughout the off season. They might train with this practitioner for 3 weeks. They and work on these things. They might train with these guys for these 3 weeks, right? Um, I think that's a really hard thing to navigate because all of a sudden you get them back maybe in market, and all of a sudden you have no idea what they just did for the last 4 months. You have an idea a little bit because you sent them what you wanted them to do. But did they do it? I don't know, right? I think that's a huge, huge part. So then what we're also seeing a lot more of is all of a sudden it's time for preseason to hit. We have no idea what you've done from a workload standpoint for the last 4 months, but we also know that we have to accomplish this, right? We have to get into the season and we have to play these games. So I think the other factor is we're dealing a lot more with some of these overuse injuries or maybe these higher risk injuries earlier on in the season. And so you're asking a staff to kind of, you already have a problem, but there's no stopping this train. This train is moving. So how do you then, right? The league doesn't want you to, I won't say the league doesn't want you to do load management, but there are certain restrictions now where if you miss an overs or if you miss, 65 games or less, you're not going to be an all-star. You can't be on first team NBA. You can't have some of these accolades. And then contracts are tied to those. So the athletes, they know that shit, I have to play 70 games if I want to be first team all NBA or if I want to be an all-star. So are they giving you the correct feedback, right? And it's a big mess, to be honest with you. In my opinion, it's a big mess because at the same time we can't force our athletes to stay in market where we can monitor this year round, but then all of a sudden we're supposed to monitor this issue that may be a problem, and we only have half of the information and half of the story, right? And I think that's a big problem. And then the last thing that I'll say is really difficult, and I would say this from working with a team now for a long period. And I think unless you've worked in team sports, it's very difficult for you to have an informed opinion on. And I say this meaning there's a lot of, different people that might work with these athletes in the off season. Well, it's a different game. And what I mean by that is our jobs are to continue to put the athletes out there on the court and get them to perform right? It's a business. The business is if the athletes aren't out there on the court and they're not playing, then you're not selling tickets and you're not making money, right? This is an entertainment business. And so the other very complex aspect of this is if we don't have our guys available, and the guys also know that if they're not available, then they can't have their accolades, and we also don't look very good at our jobs. So it's this risk management mitigation all season long, where it's like the athlete wants to get out there. They may be telling you something. You're seeing something in the weight room or with the tech, and you're saying, gosh, this isn't looking good. So then you bring up the conversation. Hey, maybe we need to pull him back from this. Well, all of a sudden you pull the player from practice. Then all of a sudden you have all of his teammates. Oh, come on, man, what's going on? There's just so many different layers. There's that factor as an athlete where I want to go out and practice and play with my teammates. And then all of a sudden I have to also worry about the longevity of my career. I also have to reach the amount of games to make sure that I get the accolades that I want so that I can get the contracts that I want, right? So there's so many layers to this story where it's like, is it the team's responsibility to keep the athletes from themselves? It's the athlete's responsibility to keep us informed of how they're feeling while they also have to perform and have to play a certain amount of games, right? I think it's just such a complex layer. And so to your point, I think we're finally seeing the perfect storm right now, where I hate to say this, but with the way that things are going in terms of, contracts being based on games played and your ability to reach a higher level of contract, you're going to keep seeing these for a little bit because there's just so many complex factors that are going into it where you cannot pinpoint it's because of the training load, it's because of this, it's because we're not doing our good job of monitoring or adding our interventions, right? I think I've heard a few different um consultants and off-season trainers talk about that. These teams aren't doing this. But the reality is, unless you've worked with a team in the NBA and with these different constraints, you really don't understand. It's a very complex, very, very complex situation that we're going through. And the athletes are going through themselves, right? I think that's the other thing is I would never place blame on the athletes, and I certainly would never place blame on the practitioners. I think it's just this is the byproduct of having so many different people trying to get so much for themselves in terms of the players for contracts, us for making sure our athletes are out on the court, the coaches making sure that they get their wins because if they're not winning games, they're going to be done. GMs, if you continually draft athletes that are getting hurt, that doesn't look good as well. If you get athletes that aren't developing, that doesn't look good as well. The owners aren't happy about that. And so it really is just a very complex, complex situation. I think we're just seeing unfortunately the byproduct of where the status is at the NBA. And I think that's part of why they're doing the biomechanics, right? Is like, let's maybe find some sort of serial testing so we can look across the league and go, is there something that we're missing? Because I know what we do from an intervention standpoint, and knock on wood, it's been okay. But also at the same time, I haven't been part of a franchise that has been, 5 years in a row going back to the conference finals where their guys are playing 30 more games, right? I think that's the difference thing too, is we're playing a lot more games. You saw some of these injuries, they happened when 7 game series, four games in 8 days. Like these are situations that we haven't put our athletes on in a long time. The speed of the game is faster. The intensity is faster than 10 years ago. You look at like Mike D'Antoni's 7 seconds or less team with the Suns, that would have been like a mid-tier
Yeah,
this year in the NBA, right? We're just dealing with a lot of factors, and now it's finally caught up to us. And at the same time, these players, they can't reach max contracts unless you play a certain amount of games. I think that's a really difficult thing is keeping these players from hurting themselves by getting them to do everything that we ask while also pushing themselves as hard as possible. It's very difficult.
man.
I know I
I,
beat around the bush on
no,
that
no,
one. I
no.
know I know it's just I really truly believe, in my opinion, we are seeing so many layers of different different parts of organizations trying to get what they want, and same with the athletes trying to get what they want, and we haven't figured out what is the equation yet.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and and until we do, I think we're going to keep seeing these injuries.
yeah. I definitely feel the same that there's a lot of guys out there like saying stuff which they probably never been in a team before. Being with a team is like there's a lot going on. And like athletes have their own stuff. Coaches want to do something, you have to do something. That's a lot. And like you mentioned, there's a lot of game. So it's hard. It's hard. I understand that. It's hard.
Yeah, and I think the other, one thing I didn't even mention, and I don't know whether it's good or bad yet. I mean, in my opinion, I'm starting to see a little bit of the downside, but like, when I first started, there wasn't all these pickup during the summer. There wasn't guys playing maybe 2 to 3 times a week during the off season. They were training and building and getting their bodies robust and doing this, right? And now that's kind of the trade-off is like there's open gyms every single place in New York, in LA, and hey, come to open runs out here, come to open runs. Well, we know that if they just keep playing this year round, and you don't have ample time to build a robust athlete, we are going to see more
Yeah.
injuries. There's no doubt about that, right?
Yeah.
I think the research is strong in that standpoint. And so that's a huge part is we mentioned, earlier on, where are these athletes on the spectrum? Of early in their careers. So, do you spend more time getting them used to playing, or do you spend that time training them to make them more robust? Right? I think I mentioned him earlier, Kelly, and some of these other guys that I have, that are veterans. They're not playing pickup in May and June, and early on in that off season. And part of that is because they know how hard and how long the NBA season is, right? And so the hard part is as our superstars are these younger superstars, right? These guys that we're starting to see that are 26, 27 years old. Have they quite figured out that end of the spectrum where they don't need to play pickup all the time? Or are they still kind of in this pendulum where I know I talk with all my young guys all the time about, I understand you feel like you need to formulate your craft, you need to keep getting better. I totally agree with you. But at the same time, you're going to have a lot of games to do that if we invest in this period to make you a more robust athlete. And that's just the trade-off. It's very difficult to get them to see that and to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. I love this. I love this. I appreciate you, coach.
No, anytime, anytime. It's so easy talking with you, and I feel like you do an amazing job with getting different people and making sure that you're gathering as many informed opinions. I love listening to other coaches that maybe I know them, a little bit just by saying hi and stuff, but getting to see your podcast and hear some of their stories, it's helped teach me a lot too. So I appreciate what you're doing for sure.
Nice.